Kick off by welcoming Adam, who I understand is an expert on the Russian Revolution, to give us a talk on why the Russian Revolution is a model not to follow. Thank you.
Okay, thanks. They tell you when you give a talk, you're not supposed to start by apologising, so I won't, but to try and justify why we should discuss the Russian Revolution. I mean, even when it took place in 1917, it was something that had happened in a faraway land where conditions had very little in common with what existed in Britain or in Western Europe or in America. And of course now, it's not just something that's happened in a faraway land, but it's something that happened a long time ago. So why discuss the Russian Revolution? I think basically because in any meeting that's discussing the idea of revolution, you can't avoid this, because the concept of revolution, which dominated people that called themselves revolutionaries in the last century, in the 20th century, was the Russian Revolution, just as in the previous century it had been the French Revolution. So what was the Russian Revolution? Well, rather, what happened in Russia in 1917? Now, other speakers will define revolution as a transfer of political power from one class to another. I think we can say this did happen in Russia in 1917, so it is legitimate to speak of a or the Russian Revolution. Now, what I want to argue is that whatever kind of revolution it was in Russia in 1917, it wasn't a working class or a proletarian or a socialist revolution. So what did happen in Russia in 1917? Now, some people might think, hearing all the talk about the glorious or great October Revolution, that the revolution in Russia happened in October when the Bolshevik Party seized power. That, of course, was certainly an important event, a very important event. It was crucial for the future course of history in Russia. But that wasn't the revolution that overthrew the Tsar and the Tsarist regime. Incidentally, it didn't even take place in October, and this is a measure of the backwardness of Russia at the time, because they were still using an old church calendar, which was 13 days behind the calendar that was in use in the West. So the actual October Revolution took place in November. Now with the Tsar, he'd been overthrown 8 months previously, in February, in fact, in March, for us. Now the February Revolution was a spontaneous, popular uprising. It began on what at the time was called International Woman Workers' Day, which suddenly now is just called International Women's Day, but at the time it was International Woman Workers' Day, which, as you know, is the 8th of March here in Russia, so it was the 23rd of February. But from now on, I'll be using the old Russian calendar, otherwise it'll get pretty complicated. What happened on that day was that some woman textile workers left the factories and had a demonstration for bread, in other words, for less small bread rations and shorter bread queues, sort of ration queues. But from then on, events moved fairly quickly. Now, here's what happened over the next 5 days, as set out in a summary in this book by Joel Carmichael, Short History of the Russian Revolution, which, in my opinion, is one of the best books on this. It came out in 1964, and it's based largely on the notes of one of the participants called Sakhanov. So, on February the 23rd, you have this demonstration. February the 24th, 200,000 workers go on strike in St. Petersburg. February the 25th, the St. Petersburg strike becomes general. Some revolutionaries are arrested, there is some shooting. February the 26th, Tsar Nicholas II dissolved the Duma, that was the equivalent of Parliament there. The deputies agreed to disperse, but not to leave the city. Tens of thousands of workers rove about the streets. February the 27th, the Guards Regiment's mutiny. The Soviet of Workers' Deputies meets, the Provisional Committee of the Duma is formed. February the 28th, the Tsarist ministers are arrested, Schlussenburg Fortress is seized, the Soviet newspaper Izvestia is published. March the 1st, the celebrated Order No. 1, Transforming Army Discipline, is published. The soldiers section of the Soviet is formed. The Moscow Soviet has its first meeting. March the 2nd, Tsar Nicholas abdicates in favour of his brother Grand Duke Michael. March the 3rd, Grand Duke Michael abdicates. The revolution is broadcast by radio to the world by the provisional government. So you can see that it only took 5 days to overthrow the Tsarist regime by popular demonstrations, strikes, and this is the crucial factor here, without this, the Tsarist regime wouldn't have been overthrown, and mutinies by the armed forces that were stationed in St. Petersburg, which incidentally, to confuse things, was at the time called Petrograd, because St. Petersburg had too much of a Germanic sounding name for a war with Germany. I think, in fact, it can be laid down as a general rule that no popular uprising can succeed if the armed forces don't at least remain neutral. I suppose we want to come to date. If you look at what's happening in Iran at the moment, as long as the armed forces stay loyal to the regime, they can have as many popular demonstrations as they like, but they're not going to overthrow the regime. To go back to Russia in 1917, in this case, the army units stationed in St. Petersburg, the capital, they were mainly conscript reservists. They weren't just neutral, most of them went over to the side of the revolution. Now the Tsar and his advisors at first decided to try to crush the uprising. A top general was asked to marshal an army to march on St. Petersburg. So before doing so, he telegraphed 10 questions to the chief of police there. And I'm going to read these because they're interesting but also amusing. They're set out in full in Trotsky's History of the Russian Revolution, which, once again, if you really are interested in the Russian Revolution, you should read it. Of course, it's biased and tendentious, but he's a good writer. He was there at the centre of things from May. Anyway, this general, he telegraphed 10 questions to the chief of police. How many troops are in order and how many are misbehaving? Answer. I have at my disposal in the Admiralty building 4 companies of the Guard, 5 squadrons of cavalry and Cossacks and 2 batteries. The rest of the troops have gone over to the revolutionists, or by agreement with them are remaining neutral. Soldiers are wandering through the town singly or in bands, disarming officers. Which railroad stations are guarded? All the stations are in the hands of the revolutionists and strictly guarded by them. In what part of the city is order preserved? The whole city is in the hands of the revolutionists. The telephone is not working. There is no communication between different parts of the city. What authorities are governing the different parts of the city? I cannot answer this question. Are all the ministries functioning properly? The ministers have been arrested by the revolutionists. What police forces are at your disposal at the present moment? None whatsoever. What technical and supply institutions of the War Department are now in your control? I have none. What quantities of provisions is at your disposal? There are no provisions at my disposal. In the city on February the 5th, there were 5,006,000 pounds of flour in store. How many weapons, artillery and military stores have fallen into the hands of the mutineers? All the artillery establishments are in the hands of the revolutionists. What military forces and staffs are in your control? The chief of the staff of the district is in my personal control. With the other district administrations, I have no connection. Well, it doesn't take much to guess what General Ivanov decided to do. He decided not to march on St. Petersburg, as you can see clearly, completely in the hands of the revolutionaries. In fact, the Tsar's advisors began to see that the only way out was for him, the Tsar, to abdicate. They wanted to abdicate either in favour of his son or of his brother. And they consulted all the top generals at the front with Austria and Germany. And all of them agreed. You say the Tsar abdicated one day, and the next day was followed by